Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. I guess it is no surprise to anyone that we're still seeing the fallout of educational achievement struggles after 2 chaotic years, almost 3 chaotic years of school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic crushed the well-being of children from low-income families, in particular, not just by closing their schools, but also by taking away their parents' jobs, sickening their families and teachers, and adding chaos and fear to their daily lives. So it's depressing, but yes, not surprising to see the bleak picture of students' academics and the still widening gap between low and high-performing students revealed by the National Proficiency Test Scores that came out last fall. California students, believe it or not, fared slightly better than students in most other states, with smaller than average declines in math and less significant changes in reading. But the test results still offer solid proof that K-12 students in California need more focused attention and resources. The resources also offer clues for parents, educators, and policymakers of how we can better help our kids. So on this edition of Then There's California, we'll look into California's post-pandemic priorities for education in the year ahead, including not only a focus on the rebound for K-12 schooling, but the importance of pre-K education, early literacy, and the survival and thriving of our state's public universities and community colleges, and how California is embarking on these investments in improving education and the well-being of its students, just as the state confronts a slowing economy and begins to debate the 23-24 state budget, with both of those fiscal inflection points most certainly impacting those priorities. And with all of that, we, of course, will look into how a young boy from Poughkeepsie, New York, grew up to be a California lawmaker and finding himself in the year of our Lord, 2023, becoming a policy leader and influencer on education issues for the largest state in the nation. Senator Josh Newman represents Southern California's 29th Senate District, which includes portions of Los Angeles County, Orange County, and San Bernardino County. A veteran of the U.S. Army, Senator Newman has focused much of his private sector experience and legislative agenda on efforts to help veterans in California transition back to civilian life after service. He's also the author of a bill strengthening California's drowning prevention law and several election reform and signature-gathering-related measures. And for much of our time in COVID, Senator Newman was the chair of the Senate's Special Committee on Pandemic Emergency Response, focusing on the long-term costs and consequences of COVID-19 on Californians. And Senator Newman is the newly appointed chair of the Senate Education Committee. The senator first joined us on this podcast at holiday time in 2021 with a couple of his legislative colleagues talking about being a Senate parent, which was one of my favorite episodes, and sharing life and awesome dad experiences with his then 5-year-old daughter, Cecily. Happy New Year, Senator Newman. Welcome back to Then There's California.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here again.
And how are you, by the way? How is Cecily, more important?
I am good. And more importantly, my daughter, Cecily, she is fine as well. She is now 6.5.
Yes.
She's in first grade. She's a Beechwood Bobcat at the Beechwood School in my city of Florida, and she is having a wonderful time. She played a leopard in the school play version of The Lion King. She had the time of her life.
That's great. Well, when we talked in the Senate Parent episode a year or so ago, you talked about the challenge you have as a dad trying to steer Cecily from a childhood focused on princesses and unicorns and trying to introduce her to skills like ice hockey and science and trying to broaden her horizons, understandably. How's that going?
I mean, I've had zero success getting her off the princess and unicorn thing, but I think I have had some success. We've gone ice skating. We went a bunch of times over the breaks. I'm getting closer to putting her on the path, my path for her as a future professional ice hockey player. But she loves school, and she's always wanted to do science experiments at home. So all that's really encouraging.
Well, I think most people out there who know you already know your story from Poughkeepsie to California. But part of the appreciation of your story is hearing you tell your story, which we're hearing for the first time in this format. So originally you are from New York, and your dad was a surgeon, right? And I'll let you take it from there.
In brief, so yes, I grew up upstate New York, a little town called Poughkeepsie. Wound up going to college on the East Coast. After college, my dad was a physician. He was a doctor. He was a surgeon. My mom was a community activist, kind of small town instigator. And she was actually on, I think kind of appropriately, I'm now the chair of education. My mom was on the school board when I was growing up. So my mom ran and was elected and proceeded to antagonize pretty much everybody over the course of a couple of years as a member of the school board. And then later took some time off and she went back later and got elected mayor, proceeded to, I hope she's not listening to this, but antagonize everybody there and lost her bid for re-election. That was a long time ago. She's wonderful. But I went to college on the East Coast, and after college I enlisted in the United States Army, went to Army Officer Candidate School, and served for 4 years in the Army as an artillery officer in a couple of different places.
And you were in Hawaii, among other places,
originally
right?
Korea, and then in my last 2 years or so, I was in Hawaii. And getting out of the military from Hawaii brought me to California. And I did the thing that I think all kind of naturalized Californians do, that I said at that time, like, this place is cool. I'll stay here for a couple months. And that was 30-something years ago, right? So I've now lived in California more than half my life.
And somewhere in those 30 years, you had professional experiences in local government, public affairs, marketing, film and TV production, internet media technology. And I know you talk about this all the time, but hey, we're here on this podcast. One of your amazing claims to fame is your brush with greatness, appearing in Mike Myers' film Austin Powers.
That is correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
That is correct. So for a couple years after I moved to Southern California from San Francisco, I worked in the film and TV business for a little while. And so I worked on a bunch of movies, TV shows, some of which you've heard of, like The Nanny, and I worked on the sequel to The Brady Bunch in production, right? By that time I finished, I was in charge of the guys who put the sets together, and I actually worked on the first Austin Powers. And only because one of the stuntmen left because he wouldn't wear a wool uniform. It turned out I was the only guy who fit the uniform. If you've seen the original Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, there's a scene where the fembots kill the security guards as a demonstration of their lethal power. And I'm the middle security guard, clearly recognizable for all of 15, 20 seconds. And you don't get 15 minutes of fame. I got like 15 seconds.
But we all get discovered somehow. I mean, Lana Turner got discovered at Schwab's drugstore. You get discovered there by chance.
I did. I got discovered by way of, hey, try these pants on. Do these pants fit you?
And the rest is DVD.
Yeah, the rest is history. Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Well, seriously, though, coming back from the service, you were really impacted by your time there, and particularly looking at supporting veterans who were coming back and trying to mainstream into society. And you actually founded an initiative, Armed Force to Workforce, to assist these young veterans in coming back to life. Coming back to civilian life.
Right. So, there's a pretty long span between the completion of my service, Brian, and when I got interested and involved in veteran employment stuff. But it was around 2012, and I'd done a bunch of things. I've been working in digital technology for a long time for a bunch of startups. And I got really interested in this question about why the young men and women coming home to California, typically from other places, but during those two wars, the Iraq and Afghanistan, we're having so much trouble finding decent career-oriented work. So I got progressively more involved with the Orange County Veterans Advocacy community. The goal was to try and match veterans who make wonderful employees, right, especially those vets that didn't have any service-related issues that would have gotten in the way of working, with employers, right, who are always looking for good employees, and there's no better employee than a well-trained veteran. And through that actually sort of was the beginning of my path that led me to run originally in 2016.
And speaking of 2016, you came into the legislature, were recalled from office in 2017, really a recall led by a bunch of misinformed mania about your vote on SB 1 at the time, one of 79 votes in the Assembly and Senate to raise the gas tax to pay for fixes on our infrastructure. You were made an example of, and you were subsequently reelected, came back in 2020 to your same Senate district, and hence you have introduced a lot of election reform and signature gathering type of bills since returning. You're back in office. The recall is the past, but it obviously affected you. How did the experience inform your policy approach and politics since you came back?
That is an interesting and very broad question. But, so we as a body voted in 2017 to raise California's gas tax to kind of true it up against the loss in purchasing power over a number of years. As you mentioned, I was one of many, right, 2/3 majorities in both houses. And I wound up the target of this very intense, very partisan recall effort, which succeeded, right? And I was the target, not because of the vote. I voted the same as give or take 80 other people, but because I was from a district that had not had a Democratic member, but I actually at that time had won the closest election in the state going into that cycle. So I was kind of the natural target for the effort to break what was then a relatively recent change in giving California Democrats a supermajority in both houses. And so what did I learn? I learned, you have to be really deliberate when you do big policies, especially ones that affect people's pocketbooks, at explaining well to the voters, to your constituents, exactly what you're doing and why. And I think if you look at school bonds, if you look at other, kind of transportation, local measures, we've learned to do that well. We probably didn't do that as well as we could have in 2017 around SB 1. So that's one lesson learned. The other broader lesson is I actually have the weird distinction, in addition to Austin Powers, I have one other kind of thing going for me. I'm the only legislator, apparently, in California history to be recalled and regain my seat, which probably means that most of them really deserved it. But it's a wonderful privilege to be able to do this work, and I will never forget it. So to have a chance to serve again is, it's simply an honor for me, and I treasure every day. And so I'm very diligent about, one, applying the lessons I've learned by way of being accessible and transparent and accountable to my constituents, but also appreciating that, this is a special privilege to be one of 120 people, one in 40 in the Senate who gets to decide, on California policies.
You and a handful of your Democratic colleagues have announced here in the new year joining together to form what's being called the Problem Solvers Caucus, and you're joining with several of your Republican colleagues to encourage political leadership that puts the public good above partisan political ideology. And one could say that's actually very generous of you, considering it was the Republicans who had recalled you. And I do see possibly a natural connection between that experience and the idea of being part of a bipartisan group to help filter out some of that cynicism and politics that led to a recall such as this. But what, in your opinion, coming together with your Republican colleagues in this caucus is the deeper message and intent?
So, I want to be clear. It's not like it was a conversion that came out of my recall. I mean, I think I'm pretty much the same guy.
I was going to give you credit for taking the high road.
No, it's fine. And I'd like to think I did. But, I'm always aware that I was just in the wrong place in the wrong time. And so I was asked, coming back in 2020, if I wanted to be part of a group, which is called the Problem Solvers Caucus, but it's modeled on federal equivalent, which is the Congressional Problem Solvers Caucus. There's about 50 members there. And our mission is the same, right? It's to create a space and basically a cohort of legislators across both houses, but just importantly across both parties, to talk seriously about how to solve or work at solving some of California's most thorny issues in ways that don't start with politics or ideology or party as the initial premise. And so we're in year 3. I'm fortunate to be one of the co-chairs, one of 4. And we now have, I think, 21 members across both houses. So it's encouraging, right? And so you've got a bunch of senators, a bunch of assembly people, but a bunch, especially new members from both parties, who are coming hopefully at policy and politics from the same point of view, which is we should be able to find at least a basis for having smart, thoughtful, thorough conversations about issues that don't simply start from the premise like Democrats do it X way and Republicans do it the other way.
Well, speaking of that, going into politics here for this new year and policy, you are the new chair of the Senate Education Committee. And the committee, if anybody doesn't read what's going on in Sacramento politics, covers an array of education issues from early childhood and K through 12 through higher ed, adult and special education, after-school programming, alternative education, career technical education. So you have a full plate, as your colleagues do as well. How does being the parent of a 6-year-old in public school, which I know you're dealing with firsthand as a parent, and the former chair of a special committee on pandemic focus your priorities going forward, not only your own personal priorities legislatively, but guiding your colleagues as chair of education?
So, I think it's definitely true that having a 6-year-old in public school it's got to be helpful for, education chair, especially, and in the Senate, my committee, right, the Education Committee, has jurisdiction over both K through 12 and higher ed. And in the Assembly, they split it. And so for at least the K through 12 part, I get to live it. And I'm sure I'm better for it, right? Because it forces me, actually my wife has forced me to volunteer every other Friday, so I get to go spend time on campus. She thinks it's good, it grounds me. But it is awesome to be in a classroom and lots of other ways as an elected guy to talk to people in the education community, but I get to see it kind of at ground level. So that's a good thing. Having been chair of the Special Committee on the Pandemic, is probably more important when you think about the work that needs to be done coming out of the pandemic, particularly on mental health, a lot of the impacts on families and family situations, as you referenced in the intro. And as we look forward, especially given the fiscal pressures that are coming to bear on the state this year and probably next year as well, I think it's really important to keep in mind where we start by way of educational dislocation, mental health needs, so that we make the right decisions if we have to prioritize less robust budget this year.
And there was a story that came out in the last few weeks the session was getting up that said if the legislature did nothing else in the next 2-year session, it would be a huge success if it addressed the huge achievement gap that separates poor and English language learner students, about 60% of the state's 6 million of them, from those students who come from more stable and privileged backgrounds and have more direct access to education support and other services, a gap, of course, which the pandemic widened. Do you agree with that? And can this session be focused in a great degree on shortening that gap?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with it, but, and I'll have to qualify that statement by pointing out that, I'm new to this committee, right? So I have lots to learn. But this is the challenge before us, right? So not only to do these very hard things in the past 2 years where we had big surpluses, it's going to be even more challenging and more important to be focused around priorities to continue doing this work, because not only is that gap important as it relates to education, it pervades all of life in California, especially as it relates to income inequality. And when you're talking about income inequality, you have to talk about other things that relate directly, which include not only employment but also housing and the average Californian family's ability to afford cost of living in this, in this high cost living state that is so pressed for housing for those who need it the most, especially in the places where they work. So that's something we all have to work on. Education policy is going to be an important component of that.
Today marks the third anniversary, I think today as we speak this Monday, since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a public health emergency. And we all know how the dominoes fell on all of that. And it's hard to believe it's been 3 years. In some ways, it feels like last week. Here we are back, but it did indeed affect those families where there already was a divide pre-pandemic. It even widened it more. And there's a lot of people that have said, why did we close the schools? We exacerbated an already existing problem and created more problems by closing the schools. But then a lot of times there's the discussion of saying, well, if we hadn't closed the schools, then what? COVID would have been even worse amongst our students. As a former chair of this committee and just as a parent, what do you think about that?
It's a good question, Brian. I think it's important when you consider that question to realize that everything makes so much more sense in retrospect, right?
Right.
And, it's important to realize what we didn't know at various junctures especially during the early phase of the pandemic. So it is probably true based on what we've learned so far on the kind of epidemiology of the disease. Children were far less susceptible to not only contracting COVID, but to negative outcomes than lots of other folks. But school is obviously a nexus in the life of any family, especially multi-generational families. So we had to be really deliberate about protecting everybody in whatever way we could. What we probably could have done better in California, especially considering we have 1,000 school districts in California, is we could have been more deliberate about learning how to best think about risk tolerance and about workarounds during the pandemic. So, there were a few school districts that did interesting stuff around outdoor classrooms. It's probably true that there was data and, so other kind of observations that was a good and safe way to do it. But in sort of the pell-mell of the pandemic, that wasn't sort of well considered. And so we probably lost a lot of time and the educational dislocation is a real thing. I mean, so many students and teachers as well sort of coming back into the swing are having to make up for lost time. And I wish we could go back. I mean, and so one of my goals as the chair of the pandemic committee wasn't simply to create better information and policies in the present. It was also to make sure that we learned better lessons looking forward. So in the event of the next public health emergency in California, we shouldn't be caught so off guard, especially as it relates to critical issues about how to continue educating our students.
I think on the ground in the classroom, and maybe you've seen this as a father of a 6-year-old volunteering and helping out in class, the trauma that is going on in the classrooms right now, the teachers feeling like they are as much psychologists and counselors and threat breakers as they are teachers. And this trauma that is existing out there in the classroom and in the home. Can you speak to that too?
So it's real. My daughter's 6, so she was from 3 to 6 during the pandemic. So, she's probably really lucky. She's pretty unscathed from what I can tell her classmates, kind of unscathed. Right? They're at an age where it's awesome to be a 5-year-old,
Right.
right? But if you're a little bit older and you have kind of a broader awareness, from like 12 and up, a lot of those kids were really adversely impacted by not just their own experience of the pandemic, but sort of the combined experience of their families. But it's also important, like that's always been a problem in California. It was just really amplified by the pandemic. And so, again, as we look forward around policies and priorities for the coming school years, mental health has to be really at the center of that, and not just for the students, but for the whole family in the ways that we can probably facilitate that.
The 2023-24 state budget released by the governor in early January is a $297 billion spending plan, and after 2 years, straight years of budget surplus, even during a pandemic, we are now facing these headwinds of economic concern, and no surprise, the $22.5 billion shortfall for the next fiscal year. And the state's really going to have to drain the aquifer, as someone said, to backfund and fill those obligations. The governor came out early on after the budget release and said that despite the shortfall, he was holding harmless those consistent needs and priorities, including education funding. And obviously, it's still a work in progress up till June 30th. How is education funding looking for this next year?
To your point, I think, if you look across a whole bunch of categories, the governor has done an impressive job so far in protecting education and educational funding from what we expect to be a very lean budget year. So for the most part, he's held education harmless, as you said, and they're continuing to implement the whole child framework that was developed a couple years ago. So this budget, for the time being, depending on what revenues turn out to be, maintains the commitments made over the last couple of years, and so that's really encouraging. In terms of higher education, what we're going to see is there were a bunch of anticipated investments, particularly around housing and other facilities. Many of those things may actually have to be delayed, and that's unfortunate because the deferred maintenance deficit across, especially the CSU and UCs, is huge, right? And so it's important to remember the students need. A class of students can't, we can wait 4 years to fix a campus. That'll be a different cohort of students, right? So that's unfortunate. Mm-hmm. But, as we move forward into this budget year, I'm grateful that the emphasis so far has been on protecting education at every level.
And I know a lot of pandemic money was put in over the last couple of years to help uplift education in California, as with other spending programs for the state.
Right.
Do we have enough of that left over so we don't have to cancel the arts and cancel
not
athletics?
necessarily, right? So a lot of the federal money runs out on June 30th of this year. That's the end of this budget year. One encouraging development was the voters passed Prop 28, the arts funding proposition. So that hopefully creates some additional resources on top of the Prop 98 funds. But it's still going to be challenging to try and figure out how to meet all these needs. And
one of your priorities, I know, has been early education, TK, as we call it. What's the attitude, the focus, the budget priority for TK going into this next year? So, California has made really impressive progress over the last couple of years in funding transitional kindergarten, but early education, early child care education more generally. And that is not only good for students, but it's also important to remember it's good for families, right? So, it is so hard in California to afford private daycare. It is so hard in California to be a dual income family and work normal service economy hours and have school start at 8 and end at 2. People are really lucky if they can tell their boss at 2, hey, I got to go pick my kids up, or work from home. And people in sort of the bottom half of the wage scale can't do that, right? So what we've done is we've created additional slots, additional opportunities for students to get full-day education. That's great for the kid. That is equally good for their families. And so I'm a firm believer in that approach of aligning kind of childcare and education with work. And if we can do that, getting back to the pandemic, that'll help get many of the people who suffered the most during the pandemic, particularly women of color, back into the labor force as soon as possible. And speaking of TK, I know we have made early literacy a priority in the past here with funding literacy coaches in poor schools, but there's still considered to be, by a lot of people, negligence in this area. And the recent test scores, maybe not specifically California, but nationwide, show that. What should the priorities be in this area of early childhood literacy? One of the challenges we face in California is just inherent in the size of our state, because it's huge, 40 million people, 1,000 school districts, but we also have the most diverse population of any state in the country. And so when we talk about early literacy, we're talking about this very challenging question of how do we meet the needs of so many different communities, so many people families coming into the educational system from different directions.
So it's a work in progress, right? And I don't pretend to know too much more than this is really important. And as we look at policies, as we look at programs, these are things we're going to have to continually work at, refine, learn from, continue to do better.
Community colleges. Now, you mentioned higher ed just a moment ago, but let's deep dive on a little bit of that. Enrollment at community colleges, particularly during the pandemic, but now it's cratered, and colleges are providing, as you know, this incredible learning opportunity to returning veterans, to older folks who never got a college degree, who can't afford the CSUs or the UCs. And even maintaining online learning has been a priority in the community colleges, and even promoting the idea of high school students taking more community college classes, just to fill the numbers, just to fill the seats. Any thoughts on more stability for the community colleges going forward?
And so to your point, I mean, this is going to be a challenge. So community colleges face sort of a dual set of pressures. One is changing demographics, and then the other is changes in the economy. And there's sort of an inverse relationship where the better the economy, the more likely people continue to work, because the work is good enough that it gets in the way of some other educational path they might take. When the economy is bad, that's when community colleges tend to see higher enrollment. But I think in California, we're doing a good job around better connecting community college curricula to workforce development. We're also doing many community colleges are doing a very good job in outreach, right? And I just had a couple of meetings with a couple of the districts who are in town for a legislative advocacy today. And I have community colleges and districts in my state senate district that are being really creative about going out to the community and promoting adult education, workforce development programs. And so their enrollments are actually up, even while kind of the broader across all the state system, it's down. So there are probably lessons there. And the key is making sure that we're offering Californians real value by way of their education. If we can do that, I think they'll respond. And I think that's a good investment for all of us.
And further looking at UC and CSU, there's a 5% increase in CSU UC funding for this next fiscal year, but the universities, particularly CSU, are dealing with declining enrollment. And you had touched on a bit the lack of affordable housing and infrastructure for students. How are we looking for the universities for this new year?
Right. And so housing is a perennial issue across, kind of every sphere in California, right? And that includes students, right? And so there is, to my mind, a fundamental difference in the quality and sort of lasting impact of your educational experience if you can have it on campus, if you can do it in a residential immersive setting. And so to the extent that we can offer California CSU and UC students the opportunity to do that, the better their outcomes, the better their experience will be. But there's a massive deficit, right? Something like 60% of CSU students do not have access to housing. And you're having a very different educational experience if you're either living from home and taking classes, or just as commonly, if you're scrambling for housing and taking classes, right? So, it's hard really to learn under that kind of duress. And so it's our obligation, I think, to make sure that every Californian has the same opportunity to have a good kind of fully immersive college experience, not just for the employment-related classes they'll take, but for the development, right? For the maturation that comes with that. But it's going to take years, right? And in a down budget year, it's really hard. But we can't forget the obligation that we have to do that.
I know that lack of student housing is part of a bigger picture of housing crisis that we're dealing with in California, but you and I believe, are from the same generation, having gone to college at a certain point. We couldn't conceive of housing problems like this for students. I mean, it was just not something we ever saw. Students living out in their car as homeless while they're going to school. So it really just speaks to how many crises that we have here in California that are affecting students who are otherwise excelling or succeeding with their educational work.
Right. And so to your point, like I never, I had the luxury when I went to school, it never even crossed my mind, right? And so I had on-campus housing, lots of other resources, and had a wonderful experience. I'm always impressed at how resilient Californians are, right? I'm not sure I would have done particularly well if I were in that space. Where,
yeah, I can't imagine.
Right, so challenged for make ends meet, pay off loans, work while schooling, not have a stable living situation, but people do, and the fact that they do proves to me that if we could do better by them, we could harvest so much more, right, out of our workforce, out of our population. Jerry Brown used to point out, and I think it's good to note, when the California system under the master plan in the 60s was originally kind of created, the state was had less than half the population that we do right now.
Right.
So we certainly haven't in that time doubled the number of slots. We absolutely haven't doubled the number of universities and colleges. And we have to figure out, how do we offer to every Californian, the same quality education that we promised back in 1960. And in many ways, we've lost sight of that. We need to really rethink and refocus on making good on that promise.
You talked about the community college districts that you have in your district. You also have Cal State Fullerton in your district. I know you have really close ties with that university. But speak to, if we're going to talk about CSU and UC and the challenges, let's talk about Fullerton just maybe as the experiment here for the moment, just in terms of how that particular campus is being affected by everything that's going on in budgeting and some of the other issues.
Sure. And I guess Cal State Fullerton is a good so touch point. I also, in my district, my current district, it changed in 24, have Cal Poly Pomona. And so let's use Fullerton. Fullerton is the largest single Cal State university system, over 40,000 students, but was built late 50s, early 60s in a city that really can't accommodate much expansion by way of its growth. And so you've got a really large share of their students that not only do they not have stable housing, they can't even park on campus to come to class, right? So it's that hard. And the school itself, most of the physical plan dates way back. And so last year was a good budget year. I was part of a legislative effort to secure funds for the expansion, for instance, of their engineering computer science facility. And we got last year half the money that they said they needed for a new really cool campus, that would do a whole bunch of things that aren't currently possible. This year, there probably isn't enough money to fund that other half. So, that really does describe the challenge, right? You've got a school that is working really hard to deliver a really good education to over 40,000 students, but it's really hamstrung in its ability to do that. And they are no different than any of the other 14 CSUs.
Looking ahead here as you get ready to begin chairmanship of the Education Committee, hearings have not started yet, but I imagine you're already seeing the education-related bills getting into the queue, if you will, for hearings that are upcoming. Anything that's marinating out there from your colleagues that is striking interest from you as chair as you see the bills line up? And also anything education-focused that you are going to throw out onto the table, considering your purview as chair now?
Right. So I guess as chair, I'll be kind of deliberate and circumspect about the bills coming to me. So, and in any given year, there's and with 119 of my colleagues, people have lots of good and interesting ideas about how to change.
And they're all telling them to you now. So
well, actually, not yet. It's the advocates so far. It's all the different organizations. So there's a cycle. The first step is new chair. And consider just how big California is and how many stakeholders there are. So my schedule is chock full, and it's awesome, right? I get getting to learn and learn hopefully quickly. For my own part, I have 3 bills that relate to education, and very briefly. One is K-12 about recess. We do not have a consistent standard across the state for recess for all children, and we also have many situations in which school districts are using the deprivation of recess as punishment, and there's lots of research that says that that's actually not a good idea. So I've got a bill that would kind of mandate recess for all in a bunch of ways that I think make sense. Secondly, another bill doing this in actually concert with the U.S. Marine Corps to provide for better mobility between states, where somebody who's accredited in one state moves into California, or vice versa.
Oh, great.
So that they can be more quickly accredited to work as a teacher in California. That's obviously good for military families for whom the spouse is often the major breadwinner. But it's also good for California, where you have a teacher shortage. And this is a good, I think, smart way, consistent with our standards, to make sure that we can add to the workforce in an expeditious way. And the last bill is it's about bathrooms, and brought to me by a constituent who has a non-binary child that was absolutely traumatized over the last couple of school years by not having a safe place or a safe experience in using the restroom of all things. And so we've got a bill, and I'm sure it'll be amended in a bunch of ways, but what it would do is require each school site to establish at least one accessible all-gender bathroom that they could use during certain hours, so they would not be subject to any kind of stigma or social pressures that would otherwise affect their mental health during a day, which is, as you get into it, more common than it should be.
As I hear you talk about that last bill, it reminds me how thankful we are that we are in California, where we can talk about a bill like this, but it doesn't become such a divisive, personal, harmful thing for the members of the community that are out there that are dealing with gender issues, non-binary issues, and we can have the debate, but it's not so political. And that kind of leads me to just a final question here with you, talking about politics and education, and how we saw the results from the 2022 elections foreshadowing some of those divides. And we have school boards that are being hijacked by ultra-conservative leaders, and concerned that we can't afford to be confronted with these divides in this post-pandemic world, and that there's threats of book bannings, as I know you've heard about, the punitive measures for teaching to or referencing LGBTQ, the local resolutions barring the teaching of critical race theory. And there are concerns that when it comes to education, we are creating two countries, that as the USA, we have an obligation to help these kids learn how to critically think, regardless of whether they're in South Carolina or Florida or Texas or California. And I know we already have some firewalls on that, and California is a safe space in a lot of ways, but even in this state, with the multicultural groups we have here, there are definitely some divides that face us. So what are your thoughts and perspectives on all of that that's facing the country, but also we see it here in California?
Yeah, so it is interesting and troubling. We're living in a time where virtually anything can become a cultural battleground, and seemingly everything does, including critical race theory, which is not taught in elementary school, and virtually any other issue. And so, sadly, for whatever reason, school boards, school districts have become a venue for these arguments, right? Extremely contentious, very polarized. And what we're seeing is, you referenced the hijacking of boards of education. This is a sad, to my mind, byproduct of apathy and kind of lack of civic participation. So you can sort of assert that somebody hijacked a board, but what they wound up doing was a lot of people got elected to school boards across the state because they felt much more strongly about a bunch of issues around education than voters on the other side did. So you have majorities in many school districts, including some in my district, where the majority are now making really strong statements about kind of the culture wars by way of curricula, hiring and firing decisions. And all of this at the end of the day is going to be at the expense of the environment in which kids learn and the curriculum that they get to enjoy. And it's unfortunate, right? So we as legislators, we as adults, we as citizens need to be fully engaged so that there's plenty of room for differences of opinion, but we want to make sure that the majority, as it always has done, is reflective of that kind of California acceptance of everyone. And that's my philosophy. And so that's one of our obligations, I think, at the state level. Elections will do what elections do, but our obligation, our sacred charge is to make sure students in California, every student has access to a quality education. Every student, every Californian gets to be whoever it is that they're destined to become without somebody telling them what's okay and what's not.
Amen to that. It is nice to talk to you. Great to have you
Always
here.
Nice
I hope
to
I
talk to
didn't
you.
cause you too much sweat with my hard, difficult, probing questions here.
You and your gotcha questions,
Yes,
Brian.
my gotcha questions. But I know, like you say, your schedule's chock full, so I'm glad you could carve out a little bit of time in that to come talk to us. And good luck with everything
Thank you.
with the Education Committee this year. And
right.
I wish you luck, and I hope we can do this again before
I
too
look
long.
forward to it, and thank you for doing this podcast.
It's a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Josh Newman, Senator from the 29th Senate District in Fullerton, the new chair of the Senate Education Committee here in the California State Senate. And that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, John Roman, Ann DeGrazia, Michelle Baker, McLeana Woods, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.